Cool. Awesome. I think I'm live. I'll watch the chat. I had some audio issues last podcast. Still kind of learning, even after podcast number 29, how to do this. But super excited to chat, Antonio. Really excited to kind of hear your story and ultimately learn more about the product that you've built. As I said earlier, I've been a longtime fan of kind of not only your career, but just like how you think about product. And kind of that product mindset that you have. So I think just to start off the conversation, I would love to just hear a little bit more about your like journey into crypto, because I do think that's unique. And then after that, we can kind of transition more into DYDX and the product that you've built there.
Sure thing. So, hey, thanks for having me again. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Antonio, the founder and CEO of DYDX. DYDX is a decentralized derivatives exchange focused on just trading of crypto perpetuals. So, kind of answering your question and getting at how I got into crypto, it was pretty different, I think, than the way most people got into crypto, and especially different than the way most people got into it at the time. So, I actually got into crypto back in 2015 when I had my first job out of college at Coinbase. I was Coinbase's 100th employee or so.
Nice.
And I, like I was mentioning, kind of got into Coinbase very differently from everybody else. Pretty much everybody else at Coinbase at the time was like super into Bitcoin, and that naturally led them to working at Coinbase, which was, by far the best company in the space, especially at the time. But I didn't know anything about crypto. It was just kind of one of the 20 companies or so that I applied to my senior year of college. And the reason I ended up working there was because they had this really peculiar interview process where they literally flew me out to San Francisco for a week. And I skipped all my classes for that week and, just work with these guys.
That's awesome.
And it was really kind of eye-opening for me because my goal at the time was just to work at a really good startup. I wasn't really sold on any particular industry, but I saw everyone working there and they were all, first of all, super high quality. And I think that's kind of evidenced by a lot of the people who have come out of Coinbase, like Fred, Olaf, et cetera.
Yeah.
All super high quality. And they were all super excited about this Bitcoin thing. Like they couldn't stop talking about it, hashing and mining. And I was like, I don't know what any of this stuff means, but man, you guys seem really excited about it and you seem really smart. So I guess I'll work at this company. Like I had a good time. So I accepted the job offer. And then while I was there, I just pretty naturally got really into crypto myself. I think even to this day, people in crypto just love to talk about crypto, right?
Yeah.
But especially at the time, it really felt like we were some of the only people in the world that kind of knew what was going on or cared for that matter. So we talk about it at lunch, at dinner every single day. And it was also just a really great front row seat to some of the really interesting things that were happening in crypto at the time. And I think it's really important history and important background to kind of just put yourself in that mindset and realize at the time how people were thinking, at least us internally at Coinbase. When I joined Coinbase, really Bitcoin was the only interesting thing in crypto
Yeah.
as far as we were concerned, and a lot of other people in the space. And we were like, okay, yeah, of course, blockchain technology will continue to improve, but Bitcoin has all these network effects, and of course, it would just adopt whatever like the latest and greatest
Yeah.
technological improvements are, which of course is totally false. And the really interesting thing that happened when I was at Coinbase, which just sold me, I think, for my career on crypto, was Ethereum was invented. And I think Ethereum is still kind of a little bit hard to wrap your head around these days, but especially back then, it was just really different than anything that had existed before. And I think it collectively took all of us a long time to wrap our heads around. But we had a great front row seat. Like we had Vitalik come and talk. We had like Joey Krug of Augur come and
Uh-huh.
teach us how to write smart contracts. Like Olaf was giving presentations about
That's
like, this
awesome.
is what gas is and all these different things. So it's kind of like forced down my throat. But I was super interested in it as well. At first I didn't get it. And I was like, okay, so it's like, I don't know, like a side chain or something on Bitcoin. And it's like,
Yeah.
you can do some other interesting stuff maybe. But then I think there was this moment for me when it really clicked. And I realized that this is something fundamentally different. And for the first time, you can write programs that execute not on a server, not on someone's computer, but they execute on the blockchain and they execute totally autonomously and deterministically. And that really kind of just convinced me that there would be something really huge to build on crypto. And that's what ultimately, after a couple more steps, kind of led me to starting DYDX.
That's awesome. An amazing story and a great place to kind of start out your career. I was a little bit later than you. I started in 2017, kind of that bull market, and was completely enamored by Ethereum at the time. And then ultimately kind of kept with it in like the bear market, which was kind of exciting. But no, it's super fascinating. And then at what point of time was it 2017 or 2018 that you left Coinbase to start DYDX?
So I left Coinbase in late 2016, actually.
Okay.
And then I worked a brief stint at Uber as a software engineer.
Nice.
And kind of my goal working at Uber was I never really planned to work there longer than a year. But I figured I would learn some more technical skills, kind of understand what a more mature company had looked like, and honestly, like make some more money because they paid more in cash, which in retrospect was a terrible decision financially. But it seemed to make sense at the time. So I was working at Uber, and my plan was to work a year. And one day I was biking into work, and I was like, screw this. I'm just like leaving today. Like I was doing somewhat interesting stuff there, but I think anybody who's worked at a big company can understand, the feeling that the company would be exactly the same whether I was here or not. Like, I want to do something that matters. So I left, and I started something that actually was not DYDX first. And I'll tell a quick story because I think it's interesting from like a learnings perspective. I started, and this was back in early 2017. So like right before crypto really started taking off the first time, a search engine for decentralized apps on Ethereum. Okay. And I built this whole thing out, and like the high level theory was, hey, if I could build a version of PageRank, which is the algorithm that Google uses to kind of score websites, but instead look at blockchain data, like that could potentially be really interesting and useful. So I built that out, was working on it full time for 4 months by myself, and literally nobody used it. I had like 5 to 10 users ever. And I kind of had taken a step back at that point in time. In my mind, I'd kind of given myself a year to start a company. So I was like 4 or 5 months through this year. I was like, man, this really seems to not be working out. What did I do wrong? And the key learning that I came away from that experience with is that timing is extremely important in startups. Which maybe is obvious to a lot of people, but was not obvious to me at the time. It's like, what is the point of a search engine if there's nothing to search for? Because it's 2017 and there were like 5 to 10 decentralized apps in the world. Like, who needs a search engine to search for like 10 things? It's ridiculous. So then I took a step back and thought, well, hey, what's something I can build that's actually useful in the market today? And back in 2017 and still to this day, the main way people are using crypto is for trading and speculation. And the other interesting input at the time was when the very first decentralized exchanges, so things like Kyber and ZeroX, and I knew Will a little bit. He used to come to a lot of the Coinbase events and stuff. But I was like, this guy seems smart. Like, what's going on with these decentralized exchanges? So I looked at that and I was like, oh, this actually seems like something useful that's being built on Ethereum. Like, if you can just build an exchange that's run by code and not by people, that's, again, fundamentally different. It seems valuable today, which is kind of the key insight. So I looked at that, and then I was like, well, okay, what comes next after your regular old spot exchanges? Seems natural that more advanced financial products, things like margin trading and derivatives, would come next. And that was kind of the genesis of the idea for DYDX and how I came up with it.
I love it. That's beautiful. 2017 was a wild time. I remember ultimately kind of getting in later that cycle where my younger brother was kind of kept bugging me about this crypto stuff. And I was still in university at the time trying to study computer science. But I think from kind of many of the ICOs, what ultimately was missing was those useful products and things that ultimately users could use. And I think that's what I got so excited about, kind of continuing to follow along after that bear market in like 2018, 2019, and 2020. What really caught my eye again was like the composability aspect on Ethereum in DeFi Summer. And so it was just fascinating to kind of watch the progression of Ethereum and the people building on top of Ethereum to actually useful applications. And I think ultimately you and I kind of share the same philosophy as like ultimately product has to be like number one at the end of the day. No matter kind of where it's built, whether it's on a blockchain or a kind of a Web 2 experience, the product still has to serve some fundamental good. Could you talk about your point of view with DOIDX and kind of your philosophy around creating the best product that you can?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you said it well. I won't rehash it, but obviously product is the most important thing in any company or venture more broadly. There just has to be some real use case for what you're building. And that's if you just read literally any book in Silicon Valley, it's like find product market fit, find product market fit, like find product market fit. And I think people in crypto, especially because of, again, like the history of crypto, oftentimes don't think about it through that lens. So I really feel like this is not a hot take. Like product should be the most important thing for any venture that you kind of build. But I think a lot of times it's not necessarily the case in crypto. People will reference things like, oh, community is more important, or, decentralization is the most important thing. Absolutely, those things are important. But if I had to stack rank them, product has to come first by far. So in terms of philosophy on how we actually build product, I think it's fairly standard, regular old Silicon Valley, let's be good product managers mentality. It's like we talk to our users, we try to identify our user segments, we identify problems that they have. We look at the technology and think from first principles about how could this technology be applied to make a 10x better product experience on some axis. Doesn't have to be all axes, but at least in some way. So I think that's how we think about it at a high level. And I would kind of still copy my answer that I just gave from 5 years ago, even to today, right? People are just using crypto for trading and speculation.
Yeah.
And I think one of the really big misconceptions that people have about crypto is that it's all kind of a scam or it's all circular. We're like creating these tokens just to trade them, just to like make them have value. And it's like, what is even going on here? But I think the thing that people don't really realize is that the main product market fit that crypto has found so far is trading and speculation. Like if you just literally think about Bitcoin, you think about like FTX, Binance, Coinbase, it's a 10x better product for trading. It's for the most part globally accessible. The transaction speeds are really fast. In terms of settlement, it's really easy to build an exchange. And that's why I think crypto has taken off so far. So really just trying to lean into that and think about from first principles, well, hey, today, like how is crypto being used? And tomorrow, how could it potentially be used? And then let's really deeply understand the technology and come up with what our hypotheses are on its 10x improvements over traditional technology, I think are probably the most important things.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I used to be product at Tesla, and kind of driving home the first principles and kind of breaking things down to kind of their fundamental components and then actually building useful things, I think I would totally echo as something that crypto ultimately continues to need to strive for. So excited that you and the team are definitely focused on that. Ultimately, kind of continuing on the product focus and what you're building at DYDX, could you talk about, maybe go into like some of the specific features or why you've kind of designed the product in the way that you have, or what kind of the end goal is, or from the user perspective. And then I think I kind of ultimately want to jump into kind of some of the more kind of different choices that you've made on like where you built the product and kind of how you're thinking about that as well.
Sure. So I think it really starts with who are the users that we're building for. Obviously, I talked a lot about trading, and traders are our users, but traders is a pretty broad category. So specifically breaking it down even more, we're building most importantly for prosumers, like individual, but call it fairly sophisticated or fairly professional traders. And again, I think that's a really good market to go after in crypto, because crypto has really created that market. Crypto and Robinhood and a lot of other things like that kind of created this new user segment that really didn't exist before. So it's them as the most important thing. Then also institutions, I would put them as lower importance than the prosumer traders. Not that they're not important, but for the most part, institutions will find a way to trade where there's organic retail flow trading. So
Yeah.
it's like step one, get the organic retail flow. Step two, kind of make that into an institutional grade product. And we have done a really good job, especially on the institutional clients, especially in the past year or so. Pretty much every major crypto market maker is trading on DYDX now, and a decent amount of funds are as well. In terms of how we think about from first principles, the product experience that we're building and why we're building it, kind of think of ourselves first and foremost as like a decentralized version of an FTX or Binance and draw a lot of inspiration from them. Not necessarily that we want to copy one for one everything that they've built into their products, into our product, but even just kind of look at the main product that we're offering today, which is a perpetual contract. And for those who aren't familiar, that's just a contract that you can trade. It's a derivatives contract that you can trade with leverage that kind of trades at the price of an underlying like Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever you want to trade. Yep. And the reason that we're offering and focusing on that product for now is pretty simple. Perpetuals trade about 2/3 of the volume in crypto, if not more. And also our goal is to become one of the biggest crypto exchanges in the world, centralized or decentralized, on kind of a long-term 5-year time horizon. So kind of by definition, if we want to be the biggest exchange, we have to offer the products that people want to trade for the most part. So I think that's kind of how we've thought about it for the most part so far. I would say that there are a lot of interesting and kind of unique product challenges and opportunities building in DeFi. Yeah. Like how do you think about governance? How do you think about liquidity mining? And then how can the product potentially be different from like an onboarding perspective, potentially from like an access perspective than centralized exchanges. But I think that's kind of where we draw a lot of our inspiration from.
Perfect. No, I love the goal of ultimately being the biggest exchange, whether it's on-chain or off-chain. I like the ambition. I think ultimately kind of one of the biggest kind of things that I found after kind of leaving Tesla and going full-time in the space was kind of focusing on the first principles of scaling. Because when I started digging into kind of some of the consumer metrics of like users or people that have interacted with smart contracts, even though the TVL was rather large, the number of users and kind of even the more popular applications were like still in the hundreds of thousands, or definitely less than like 100 million, which unlike the Web2 comparison. So I really tried to focus on like, how do blockchains actually scale? Because this is like one of the biggest bottlenecks of like getting more people into, I would say, crypto more broadly, and then affects everything, like the application level, the engineers, how they think about product and designing product. And I think especially building a decentralized exchange, that's goal is ultimately being one of the largest exchanges worldwide. Scale is very important in high transaction throughput. Could you talk about kind of your thought process of initially kind of building on a layer 2 and Starkware, and then ultimately why you have decided to move to Cosmos, and ultimately trying to create the best product that you can in each one of those steps or iterations?
Yeah, so just a bit of background in terms of where we're at today with our current product. Our current product, as you mentioned, is built on top of a layer 2 rollup that rolls back up to Ethereum, and we built that in partnership with Starkware, and it uses a technology called Stark-based rollups. And the other kind of important thing to understand about our current product is that it's a hybrid centralized, decentralized product. Of course, it's non-custodial. Of course, it's based on smart contracts. That's kind of the decentralized part. And then the central part is we run an off-chain order book and matching engine just on servers on AWS, like a normal company, that kind of settles up to the smart contract platform eventually. And then our big goal for the next version of our protocol is that it is fully decentralized. This was always the goal. I'm a big believer in what you might term progressive decentralization. Like back to our previous conversations, the first thing that's really important is to find strong product market fit and then kind of decentralize after there. I think it's not totally... That's not like totally binary. I think you can do both decentralizing while finding product market fit. And a lot of times decentralization is the key thing that can give you product market fit, whether it's composability or access or user ownership or kind of all the things people talk about and are excited about with DeFi. But that's kind of where we're at right now. So, okay, we have this system that a decent part of it in the order book and matching engine is centralized. And the main reason for that today is for performance reasons. And again, that's really important because our customers are more sophisticated, right? They're kind of the institutions, they're the prosumer traders. They want to trade derivatives. They want all the order types. They want high throughput and want like it all basically, because that's what they get on FTX and Binance. So you have to compete with that. So we took a step back about like 8 or 9 months ago, and we asked ourselves, well, how do we decentralize this order book and order matching engine? Because that's the key component that requires really high throughput. Order books, the main way people use order books, or the main like source of the throughput needs, is market makers, and they're basically just placing and canceling orders with trading bots all the time. And on our current product right now, we serve about 1,000 requests per second or so on our backend. And the important kind of key insight here is that most of these orders that are placed never get filled. And that's really important because that means that for about 1,000 orders per second, that means we only have a throughput of about 10 trades per second. And therefore, the settlement logic can be much less scalable than kind of the order book and the order matching engine. So it's this like interesting problem where we need different levels of scalability for different parts of the system. So we took a look around and we said to ourselves, hey, like we want to at least support the level of throughput that we are supporting right now on our current exchange. And then of course have ambitions to grow bigger. But we want to support, let's call it 1,000 transactions per second today, or when we launch V4. And not only do we want that, but we want to support 1,000 transactions per second with very low gas fees. Because again, remember what our users are doing. They're just placing and canceling orders all the time. If you're going to tell them that, you know, they have to pay even single-digit cents per order, that's like a major consideration. So we looked at all the different blockchains, and there were 3 major classes of things that we considered. First of all, we considered building our own chain, which is ultimately what we ended up doing. And I'll talk more about that in a second. We considered building on, call it like a monolithic layer 1 chain, specifically Solana, maybe potentially other things. And then we also considered building on Starkware's Starknet rollup chain, which is kind of a general purpose Stark-based rollup system.
Is that an L3 or does it still settle to Ethereum?
It's an L2, yeah. Okay. So it still settles to Ethereum, yeah. And we looked at all of those and we asked, okay, well, which one of them can support our requirement of 1,000 orders placed per second with very low gas fees? And none of them can support that. I think for anybody that hasn't kind of looked into it pretty deeply, a lot of the like sticker, like, you know, on the website transaction per seconds that you see are just like wildly off, like 1,000x off. As far as we can tell, and we did some good research on this, Solana can support maybe like a few hundred per second, sometimes up to 1,000. But again, we don't have all of Solana to ourselves, and there's like some gas fees that are associated with that. So we felt like that may not be a good choice. We looked at Starknet, and that also doesn't support nearly the amount of throughputs that we would need it to right out of the gates. And I think the thing that people focus on with rollups when it comes to scalability is the usage of the layer 1 chain. For example, people talk about with optimistic rollups, like, oh, you need all the data to be put on Ethereum, and like that's the bottleneck. For Starkware, kind of the bottleneck usually is proving, because these like zero knowledge proofs take a huge amount of computing power and time to generate. Starkware is working on increasing that by orders of magnitudes and then doing an awesome job. But it's still where we need it today it's not quite there yet. The other thing that people don't really realize is just that literally running like a decentralized network of nodes, which you would need on a rollup as well, right? If you don't want a centralized prover, is pretty hard. Like things like transaction propagation, like the CPU usage of the like validators or whatever is usually the bottleneck. And that kind of made that like option prohibitive for us. Our conversations with Starkware sort of escalated to a point where we did understand pretty deeply the network, and us and Starkware sort of came up with a solution. Well, okay, like we could just build a separate network to run the order book and order matching engine, and that could roll back up to Starknet. And we considered that, but then the ultimate thing that we came up with is building our own chain. And the reason for that is not because Cosmos is way more scalable than like any other technology blockchain out there. It's not. It supports roughly like the same amount of throughput as a lot of other blockchains, like maybe like 50 to 100 transactions per second if we tune it well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'll improve in the future, but like that's where we're at today. So then you may ask, well, okay, like how are you going to solve this gap? Cosmos can only do 50 to 100 transactions per second. How do you get 1,000? And that's kind of where the key insight came in from our side, is that we can build what we're calling kind of a decentralized but off-chain order book network on top, or basically into the code that the validators run. And you can only do this if you control your own chain, right? Because if you're building smart contracts, you don't really control any of the infrastructure underneath you. But when you're building a Cosmos chain, you're literally coding the nodes themselves. And the important insight as to why this gets you so much more scalability, and this was also kind of a product insight, is that we feel we don't need to have consensus on the order book. We do need it to be decentralized, but effectively how the product or the technology is going to work is that the order book will sort of exist in the mempool, or like the same like place you might normally put the mempool of transactions. Every validator will have their view of the order book, just like every validator in Ethereum might have their view of the transactions that they want to put in the next block. And then each block, like the orders get matched together, and the amount of throughput in Cosmos is fine. But there's a lot there. Yeah, I'll stop there and kind of take any questions as well.
No, I have lots of questions. Yeah, I would love to go back to kind of some of the alternatives that you explored initially. You kind of first mentioned Starkware. I think I've kind of talked with a lot of technical people now, and my view of L2s has kind of also shifted over time. It is interesting when you kind of, I think the ideal model with layer 2s is the single sequencer or prover. But then ultimately, once you move to multiple different provers, it's kind of like an additional blockchain because you have to have the data throughput and all that. So I'm curious, like, what is the maximum kind of upper bound that you found on Starkware?
It's a good question. And I don't want to speak for them too much in terms of what they feel the ultimate upper bound would be. Probably literally today, it would be something on the order of like 50 transactions per second or so, potentially higher based on how they tune it and how complex the transactions are. But it wasn't close to kind of the 1,000 level that we needed. Yeah. And again, it's like a lot of your point that when you're building a layer 2, if you start decentralizing the layer 2 itself, it starts to look like another blockchain. Yeah. It is better because you don't necessarily have to follow like all the same rules as a blockchain does, and you're always rolling up and getting security from the layer 1 that you're rolling up to. But there are quite a lot of challenges there, and nobody's really even started from a production standpoint testing out things like a decentralized network of sequencers or provers or whatever kind of the network requires.
Yeah,
I think I'm still really excited about them for the long term. And maybe kind of zooming out, one of the other things I believe about blockchain and DeFi is that it's really important to always build on the best possible technology. And that's not immediately obvious, but I think one of the things that continues to excite me about blockchain technology is that it's increasing exponentially. You know, maybe it's slower than some of us would like, and we're like, why is the decentralized future not today? But it is increasing exponentially all the time. Like we can process exponentially more transactions, the latency is lower. So that kind of insight led us to the thought that it's really important for us to continuously build on new technologies. We shouldn't try to forecast out like 5 to 10 years, like what's going to be the best blockchain. It's like, let's build this thing for like a 2 to 3 year shelf life. Maybe it's longer, that would be great. But if rollups are ultimately the thing that wins and a lot of these problems are solved, then yeah, of course we would use them long term.
Yeah, so that was my kind of leading into my next question. When evaluating these things, I think, as you mentioned, a lot of the progress has been rapid, especially in kind of, I'd say, some of the newer architecture designs such as Solana, and how they kind of continue to refine the process of like increasing throughput. Today, Solana, I think I've seen like when it's like doing well is kind of averaging around 500 transactions per second. But how did you the team ultimately kind of think about evaluating in the 2 to 3 year time frame of like these chains continuing to get better as they take advantage of, say, increasing like hardware and increasing bandwidth?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we normally try to be a little bit conservative because it's like the entire product and company that we're building on in terms of
Yeah.
where they're at today, rather than necessarily trying to forecast where they're going to be in 2 or 3 years. And on the product requirement side, especially because we literally have a product right now that's trading at like $1 billion a day or so.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that when we shift that to the next version, we're not taking a huge step back. So we really look at things like where they're at today rather than necessarily where they could potentially get to in the future. I think understanding and having a view on where they could potentially get to in the future is really important, but is not necessarily the critical driving factor. And I would have probably said the exact same thing 2 or 3 years ago when we built the Starkware integration. Like, why did we build on Starkware and nothing
Yeah.
else? It was pretty simple because Starkware both had this really exciting new technology and it was already production ready. Like they were already running with Diversify and a couple other projects, and like it worked, and we could see that. I think there's a lot of timing and technological risk when
Going
you're
back to the
relying on
beginning of timing.
external teams. Yeah. When you're relying on external teams to kind of build things on a certain time horizon, not
Yeah.
to say that that never happens, but counting on that to happen is a big risk at least.
I definitely agree. And I think that's kind of more holistically why I've been like so focused on scaling and trying to figure it out from like first principles, like what are those bottlenecks and how ultimately do the different design architectures ultimately what trade-offs do they make and how they implement things, because ultimately like I'm it took me a while like you to figure out all the stuff and like figure out Ethereum and why it's even meaningful or useful. But now once you kind of wrap your head around it, figuring out like once it actually scales, like that's super interesting. And I would love for ultimately like engineers, the application engineers, to not think about any of this stuff and just like automatically kind of have the application knowing that it can scale if you have product market fit. And it saddens me that today is not the case. But kind of jumping off that, I would love to kind of, so you touch upon Cosmos and building in there. Could you talk a little bit more about how you kind of see the partnership or building on top of Cosmos and what that looks like with your own kind of Cosmos hub? How many like validators? What are you kind of thinking
Yeah.
along that lines and like decentralization?
So we're building a couple different classes of things with V4, all of which will be fully decentralized and open source. The first thing that we're obviously building is our own node software for the DYDX chain. We base this off of Cosmos SDK, which is just kind of the code framework that you can build new Cosmos chains with. And that's kind of where the bulk of the work is going. We're also building another layer, which I personally think is really, really important, actually, and that a lot of people overlook, which we're calling the indexer layer. This is sort of similar to like an Alchemy or like an Infura or something. And it's important, I think, for us to build that, first of all, because not any of the major like ones like Alchemy or Infura support Cosmos right now. But even more important than that, we want to give like a really specific API to our traders. Like we've tried pretty hard to create a product that from both a user experience perspective and a API integration perspective feels like a centralized exchange, even though it's not. So like on the indexer, it'll have API endpoints that are like, get all my orders or give me a WebSocket stream to the open order book. And these are things that the front end and the actual product require to be done at a high level to do their job. Like a lot of projects sort of will just build, if they're only building their own chain, just the node software itself, and then the kind of web interface will connect directly with the nodes. So we're building those two things, and then we're also building front end, of course, and a mobile app, and that's kind of the full stack of what we're building.
Awesome. Very cool. So do you feel like, because, I mean, you have kind of migrated to your own chain in some regards, that you have to build out some of that functionality that would be more native to like other ecosystems if you didn't? And how do you kind of balance building out just the infrastructure compared to like adding additional product features, as you mentioned, is kind of like the
Yeah.
goal?
It's a really good question. So yes, definitely, there's a lot more stuff that we have to build because we're building our own Cosmos chain. Kind of zooming out a little bit, again, why did we make that decision? One of the other things that I'm really proud of at DYDX is I feel like we have definitely one of the best engineering teams in DeFi. And we just have a lot of experience and capacity to build really new things. I always kind of find it funny when everybody in crypto talks about like EVM compatibility and like, oh, but there are all these Solidity developers and like they'll come use my chain. I agree it's good from a bootstrapping perspective, but good engineers can build any technology. And that's kind of how we thought about it with DYDX. So we're happy to build the stuff out ourselves. And in some ways, we even kind of want to do that. And I think you see this in the evolution of products and companies a lot of the time, where they'll start out more just horizontally integrated, and they'll integrate into like a lot of different providers to do the things that they need to do. And then over time, if the product is successful, you see it be more vertically integrated. Like you want to control from a development perspective, all the levels of the stack. So that could mean specifically things like, oh, can we control the wallet experience and kind of build an integrated wallet into our product? Like that's something that we likely will do. Like, can we control the indexer layer? Can we control, obviously, like the core blockchain layer and just make everything custom and special purpose for DYDX? And I think that's also a pretty good competitive advantage for us. Just there like really aren't that many good developers in DeFi, just in terms of the number. There are some great ones. There's just like not a lot of them. And I think we have like a sizable portion of them at DYDX. And that's like gives us a lot more flexibility to really build, again, the best possible product experience and build on any technology that we feel like could serve us best.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I'm super fascinated to watch it kind of play out. It's definitely a big engineering challenge more holistically, but I'm confident in your team.
It's going pretty well. We already have an internal testnet running that can service like 500 to 1,000 orders per second, and awesome. There's a lot of improvements that we want to do from here.
And what are you guys ultimately what is the throughput required, I guess, that you would need to be like the world's largest exchange? Have you guys ran
It's a good question. I think we're kind of starting with at least not regressing from the point we're at right now in terms of supporting the like 1,000 per second as a benchmark. It's hard for it to say exactly where we need to get to eventually, but it's 10,000, 100,000, potentially even more. Usually matching engines can process and require like a really high level of throughput. So if we want to like be as big as the CME or something at some day, we'll have to continue growing from here.
100,000, that'd be wild. And do you think it's fundamentally like not possible like to have everything on chain, or do you think eventually as blockchain scalability gets better that it will be possible to do on chain as well?
I definitely think that it won't be possible to do everything that you might want to do on chain. Mm-hmm. And I think from like a computer science perspective, maybe a parallel I could draw is like a database. Like what's the cardinal rule of databases in software engineering? They're like 100 or 1,000x slower or whatever than just running stuff in process. So therefore you gotta like be really careful about when you use a database. And that's just like a guiding principle of software engineering. Yeah. And I think the same principle kind of applies to blockchains as well. You can absolutely use them, and you should use them for what will give you that 10x improvement. But I think this kind of, maybe I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I like kind of feel like this fantasy of just, we can run unlimited scalability on a blockchain. I can't really see that happening, at least in the next 5 to 10 years.
That makes sense. I guess kind of staying on like the architecture design standpoint, one of the drawbacks, at least initially, with the Cosmos design or application-specific design is the lack of composability. But you kind of, as you mentioned, get some increased scalability from that. How are you thinking about those different trade-offs from the product perspective?
Yeah, and they absolutely are trade-offs. And I think anyone who will try to tell you that one technology or product is objectively better than another one is just wrong. Like everything is trade-offs. So we did have to make trade-offs to get kind of this level of scalability. And I think at some level we traded off against composability. We don't even have a ton of that right now because we're built on our own Cosmos chain, Starkware chain right now. But there is some level of composability that does benefit our product on Ethereum. For example, we have a deposit, like this protocol only supports USDC collateral, but we have a deposit flow on Ethereum right now that uses 0x to allow people to deposit ETH, and then it just gets traded for USDC. And that was like a really easy integration because it was composable. So yeah, I think we've made a trade-off against composability and what we got out of that is just a really vertically integrated product. I would much rather have that for now, at least in the current market. I do kind of buy into the narrative of composability being a really important advantage of DeFi, but I don't think it's necessarily the only one. Like I think community ownership, like improved access is really important as well. But it's something that we're kind of tracking for the long term. And I think it will continue to improve even on other Cosmos chains. And maybe just give you an example of that as well. Like, and this is something we're literally building right now. There is some composability on Cosmos chains with IBC. So one of the problems that we're thinking through, just as an example, is how can users deposit onto our chain? Right? It's really important. All the like bridges are pretty janky right now, and people are scared to use them. So how can we kind of solve this problem? What we're doing is kind of twofold. First of all, we work pretty closely with Circle and USDC to get a native deployment on Cosmos. And then also we are building an integration very likely with Osmosis that'll kind of make it really easy to use Osmosis and Axelar to just bridge your USDC over, trade it for native USDC on our chain, and then for that native USDC to be IBC'd over to our chain.
I think IBC is unique in the sense that they are kind of trying to build it natively in the protocol layer. How do you see that playing out in the Cosmos ecosystem, and also more holistically bridges, and how that, I think you kind of touched upon it, but like maybe even diving deeper, kind of your thoughts on like different ecosystems and bridging into like Cosmos or even DYDX directly?
Yeah, bridges are obviously challenging. I don't have like a ton of original thoughts beyond what the people who are working them will probably tell you. But yes, absolutely, they're risky. And I think we just need to see one that continues to run in production without any issues for a long time. But that's another reason why we're focusing not on storing bridged assets as collateral on DYDX, at least to start, but hopefully at least for stablecoins, supporting the more native versions of them. I'm pretty excited about IBC overall. And again, I think the most important thing is crypto is what happens in production. Like there's so many ideas, but like an idea is not useful, at least from an integration perspective, until it's been built and until it's running in production. And projects like DYDX have confidence in being able to use it. So I think IBC is a good example of that. And obviously there have been other Cosmos chains as well that have been successful from a tech perspective. So that gave us a lot of confidence to build what we're building right now.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, I'm super fascinated. People always ask me like what I think, and I think everything will work. It's just kind of what trade-offs you make, and then ultimately kind of what you optimize for. Speaking of trade-offs, though, what are ultimately you built an order book, and I think at the time on like even on Ethereum, the base layer, it wasn't really possible to build an order book. And I think that's ultimately how like Uniswap and the AMM got spun up. But how would you talk about like maybe some of the advantages of an order book versus like an AMM, and why you decided to go with the order book design?
Yeah, again, I'll bring it back to our users and kind of what they care about. They want a pretty sophisticated trading experience. And we felt like we could build a much better trading experience on an order book than an AMM. I don't necessarily think in DeFi order books or AMMs is objectively better. Again, there's a lot of trade-offs that are involved. I don't have super original things to say about AMMs, but they're really good at trading like the long tail of tokens, really good at liquidity provision, like deposit to become a market maker. Like that's something that's fundamentally new. But for us and kind of the markets that we have, we require really high liquidity for all of them. And that's especially important for derivatives markets because the liquidity of the platform literally is critical for the stability of the platform. Like if the price falls and you're trying to liquidate positions and there's no liquidity, it's not going to go super well for the protocol. So it's important for us to be able to offer good liquidity. And we felt like that could be done a lot more effectively through targeting market makers than necessarily an AMM.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I think it's been interesting now, kind of with me and my research trying to focus on like some of the higher performance chains and some of the things that are uniquely enabled by high performance, such as order books. And I've been fascinated. I kind of like compare blockchains in many regards similar to like the early days of the internet, where it's kind of like dial up and then you get to broadband and fiber optics. And each time one of those jumps happens, engineers and what they can build kind of becomes a much greater sandbox per se. But no, it's super interesting. Some of the questions in the chat is like, how do you think about MEV and kind of this new architecture and design? And is the initial kind of set of validators going to be permissioned, or ultimately do you want to make that a permissionless kind of validator set as well?
Sure, I'll take the first one first because it's easier. Yes, the validators on the DYDX chain will not be permissioned at all. It'll just be based on the stake weight of the kind of token that's used for the platform. And then kind of taking the first question in terms of MEV, I don't mean to write it off too much as it's not important, but rather to say that this is a really hard problem literally every decentralized exchange is facing. And I think it's important and we are focusing on it, but we don't have like a magical answer for it right now.
Yeah.
The one thing that some of the thoughts that we've had that we feel like MEV will be mitigated, not eliminated, but mitigated a lot more on the DYDX chain relative to other networks, is that it's a special purpose chain, right? So the validators, at least presumably, have like the interest of the system at heart. And then, if they don't, or if they're front running all the transactions, and that should be pretty easy to see through literally just looking at the blockchain, and they can kind of be voted out by stake and et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably the biggest thing. Like, we're exploring some other things that we feel like may help, such as transaction propagation. So for example, one of the things that Solana has done a really good job of is kind of funneling all of the transactions to whoever the active leader is first before they kind of disperse through the entire network. And I think this is important both from like an MEV perspective, also as well as a latency perspective. It's just like propagates a lot faster if you send them directly to the validator, the leader. So these are all things we're looking at. Again, don't have any magic answers here, but I do think it should be a much better position than a lot of other decentralized exchanges, just because of a lot of the transparency that we're putting into the validators. Like, they have to report in real time, like all the trades that they're matching. You can run a lot of analytics on that. You can, stake to the ones that are being presumably honest, and use data to kind of inform that decision. But something we're going to keep thinking about.
That makes sense. Do you feel like I've been super interested in just like the Cosmos consensus and ultimately kind of the trade-offs that they make there. I think it's in the Cosmos ecosystems, it's a little bit hard to have like over 150 nodes just because of how consensus is kind of arrived upon. Are you guys shooting to kind of get to that maximum of 150, or what is kind of the initial node count that you're thinking?
Yeah, again, it's not really up to us. Like, we're just primarily exclusively focused on developing the code and open sourcing the code.
Allowing other people to run it.
And then, yeah, exactly. And that's why I mentioned the permissionless nature of the validators is actually a really important decision. In terms of the absolute node count that we'll have, I honestly don't know. Like, we're literally not really talking to the validators right now. But I would guess probably somewhere in the like 25 to 50 range to start, and then probably scaling up over there. The other thing I'll say is, in addition to like node and validator count, which is important, but it's not the only important thing. Like, the distribution of the underlying token itself is important, like how easy or hard it is to stake to validators. A lot of things kind of go into the equation, and I feel like we can build a pretty good product overall with a very sufficient level of decentralization. Like, certainly we're not going to get to the level of a layer 1 Ethereum with like thousands of validators anytime soon, but I think that's okay. And I don't think it impacts the like security of the system too much. If anything, like the distribution of stake weight and validators, I think is a lot better on some of these new chains like Solana, like other Cosmos chains like Osmosis and the Cosmos Hub.
Yeah.
Just because there's not quite as much like centralized action around staking as there is on like an Ethereum or something like that.
I totally agree. I think decentralization is like one of the hard parts in the industry, and being able to quantify it is kind of one of the harder aspects, and a lot of it can be hand wavy. I kind of prescribe myself to like the Nakamoto coefficient and like being able to like understand like how many full nodes there are and then like how many independent parties there would be needed to collude or start to censor transactions. Do you kind of share that mindset, or how do you kind of view decentralization from like a quantitative standpoint more
I
holistically?
definitely share that mindset. I think the Nakamoto coefficient is a good way to think about it. And there's just a lot of levels of the stack that you have to look at for that. It's like, again, what's the distribution of the token? Like we can have a million validators, but if like somebody owns 50% of the DYDX token supply, it's still not going to be super decentralized. And then validator counts still somewhat important, but like I think we just have to be honest with ourselves. Like, where is the absolute value of these Nakamoto coefficients right now? It's probably like single digits, even on your favorite blockchains that are
Ethereum,
allegedly
since
super
it moved
decentralized.
to proof of stake, is actually two,
Exactly.
which has
Yeah.
shocked me.
Yeah.
Solana and AVAX, I think, are the highest at like 31 or 32, respectively. Um, so yeah, I think when you look at the quantitative stuff, it surprises people a lot, and so I don't know. The
Yeah.
industry is
I
funny
agree with
though.
that.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate your time. We've been chatting for about 50 minutes. I kind of maybe wanted to touch upon going back just to like the feature set and getting to ultimately being the biggest exchange in the world. What are kind of some secrets or like things that you're looking forward to in the DYDX community or product roadmap? And then afterwards, I guess I can get into like some more like spicy questions. Try to
Sure.
wrap it up on spicy questions.
Yeah, I'll keep this one quick. The main thing we're obviously focused on right now is decentralizing the product. So we've kind of approached that with like, okay, let's just try to keep as close to the product experience we currently have, maybe improve in a couple ways like onboarding, but for the next product. In terms of where we're going after that, I think it's still somewhat up in the air, but we're interested in potentially branching out to like spot markets, potentially lending and margin trading, potentially other things. But I think that's still a little bit up in the air in terms of what we want to build there. Kind of the overall thought behind that is we see that being the case on a lot of centralized exchanges where users are much more likely to use the product if there's everything they want to do on just this one product, rather than using a different exchange for your derivatives trading and then like different exchange for your spot trading or whatever. So I think that's something that we likely will be working on in 2023.
That totally makes sense. Looking forward to kind of having the all-encompassing product suite. It's very cool. Awesome. I think it's just super impressive what you've built. It's awesome just to kind of been following your journey from afar and how much success you've had and the risk that you've taken to do so. I think always looking backwards, it's everybody says it's easy to kind of do the things that you did and say it's obvious, but going forward and making those decisions in real time, they're not as easy to do. So definitely applaud you for taking those risks. But yeah, I try to wrap up the podcast with like spicy questions. What is kind of some ecosystems outside of Cosmos that you think do things uniquely well and that you're like excited to watch going forward? And then on the flip side, what are some ecosystems that you think are doing things uniquely bad?
Okay. Yeah, on the good side, I would say I would put Solana up there as well. I'm definitely interested in kind of tracking Solana and this whole class of monolithic L1s, let's call it. I do think that's really interesting technology and serves a wide array of use cases. So I think that one's pretty interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm somewhat interested in all of the roll-up chains as well. I think the level of scalability that they're offering right now is still not super exciting. I think it's on the order of like 10 to maybe a little bit higher X the throughput that Ethereum can do.
After building
Um,
on
yeah.
like Starkware, just like a layer two more broadly, has it like changed your view or kind of have you become more bearish on them in like the medium term? Especially kind of with the single sequencer and kind of the low overall transaction throughput?
I guess bearish on like a 1 to 2 year time horizon, maybe. But again, our product is pretty unique. Like if I were Hayden and I were building Uniswap, like I would not build my own Cosmos chain. Like it doesn't really make sense. I don't need 1,000 transactions per second to serve Uniswap. And clearly Uniswap has product market fit. like if I were them, I would probably do the same thing that they're doing and just build on a layer 2 platform and make that experience really easy. So again, it's all trade-offs, and I don't think anyone is objectively better than the other. But yeah, I think it's always just good to be like excited about new technology in general. Like even if you don't think that it's going to work, like you're like, Solana is just like centralized scam or whatever. I think it's good to be able to see how it's actually going to work, and the projects that are being built there. So you have here like sponsored by Magic Eden is like a good example of that. Like some of the other ones on Solana as well. But yeah, I'm very excited about like just a lot of the technological innovation in general that's going on in crypto. I wouldn't be like too negative on any of it. Maybe the only thing I'd be negative on is like things that are clearly centralized that are like sort of masquerading as decentralized, like a BNB chain or something like that. But I feel like that's not a super hot take.
No. Cool. No, I appreciate it. Any kind of closing thoughts or anything that you want to touch upon that I didn't talk about?
No, I think that was a great conversation. Appreciate all the great questions. Yeah, we're getting pretty excited about V4. As I mentioned, we already have an internal test net running where we can place match all the orders. Not a launch date specifically yet. We're looking to open source the code by the end of the year, and then just continue building from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Antonio. It was really a pleasure. Again, it's been awesome just to kind of watch from afar, and it was really a pleasure to chat and to kind of pick your brain on all the different product aspects and kind of how you're thinking about the space, and even kind of the different scalability challenges. So definitely appreciate your time, and I wish you the most success.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me.